From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, the director of CT Media, and today on the first segment of our show, I'll be joined by Nicole Martin and Madeline Kearns. We're going to talk about some stories that have been in the news related to transgender issues. Then, I'll be joined by CT's news editor, Daniel Silliman, to talk about a piece that he wrote this week reflecting on Christianity Today's relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. Then, Daniel and I will end with another regular segment called Hey Daniel, What's Weird? Stay with us. All right, so joining me now are Madeline Kearns, a staff writer at National Review and a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. Maddie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And then with me as well is Nicole Martin, Chief Impact Officer here at CT. Nicole, welcome back.
Thanks, Mike.
So I want to talk about transgender issues. They've been in the news for the last couple of weeks here. And really, there's sort of two main areas that have caught my attention and that I've seen a lot of coverage on. The first is kind of this issue of corporate sponsorship that has particularly showed up around Dylan Mulvaney. Dylan is a TikTok influencer who transitioned about a year ago, has been documenting that transition online, and has been the subject of a lot of serious criticism from the right in that sort of the womanhood that they embody is a very performative, almost a parody at times. And so the reaction was swift. It was intense. One of the sponsors was Bud Light, which is a very surprising brand to be advocating transgender issues. Kid Rock got all of his Bud Light out onto a lake and shot it with a machine gun. You saw a lot of sort of over-the-top reactions like that. But then later in the week, there was another event that took place that I think highlights another dynamic around this. And this was at San Francisco State University. Riley Gaines, who was an All-American swimmer at the University of Kentucky. She was a swimmer that competed against Leah Thomas, a transgender athlete who won several awards at the championships last year. Gaines actually tied Thomas at the 200-meter freestyle at that championship, and has been an outspoken activist on the issue of trans women in sports. So Gaines was speaking at San Francisco State. Around the time she had concluded that event, a group of protesters kind of rushed the room. There's this scrum. You can watch the videos. It's pretty violent. Gaines has alleged that she was physically assaulted. There's definitely a crowd pressing in, trying to get to her. Campus security then escort her out of the room. They can't get her out of the building because the doorway is blocked from another group of protesters. So they bring her to another room. They shut the door, and it took 3 hours for them to get the crowd to disperse and to get enough police on site to escort her out. So obviously that caught the attention of a lot of folks in the media. So before we dive into either one of those specifics, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you, Maddie, is this is a beat that you've covered for the last bit. Maybe let's step back a little bit and tell us kind of what was your entry into these issues and where are we now as these things are starting to kind of get more heated?
Yeah, so I actually started this beat, this coverage about 5 years ago, and it was right when I started at National Review. I was their incoming William F. Buckley Jr. Fellow, and I originally started writing about transgenderism in the context of free speech. So it was the paper on rapid onset gender dysphoria that came out of Brown University, written by Dr. Lisa Lippman. And she had just noticed from parental reports this major uptick in the number of adolescent females suddenly identifying as male. And she'd written about this in the context of a scientific inquiry, and all hell broke loose. There were activists calling for her to be fired. I think she herself was quite surprised at this reaction. She's not a conservative. She's very much in keeping with secular liberal worldview, and she just was trying to do her job. And so I originally wrote a piece saying, well, first of all, it's ridiculous that people are reacting like this. She's just doing her job. But secondly, like, this is an interesting phenomenon she's noticed here. Maybe we should look into this. And the more I looked into it myself, the more I realized that this was just really badly underreported. Now, that was 5 years ago. Now I think the media's caught up, and certainly you've mentioned this extreme polarization we're seeing around this issue, where you really have one extreme or the other. You really just have people who think this is a wonderful idea and we need to fully embrace it, or you think the people who think this is just insanity. And I'm definitely in the latter camp. I think this stuff is pretty insane and difficult to justify. And there's so many different angles to it. We could talk about women's rights. We could talk about child's welfare in terms of what's going on in medicine just now. We could talk about free speech, language. Really, it touches on so many aspects of life, which is one of the reasons that it's so thorny and controversial.
Well, we've talked a lot on this show over the 4 months or so that we've been producing it, just about the nature of the polarization and the impossibility of being able to even have healthy conversations about these things. This is a topic that maybe, I mean, of all the things I was trying to think of today, it elicits the most emotion that I've seen at this time. And I'm just wondering how you, as you have thought about this, as you've talked to young people about this, what's your sense of even the possibility of a constructive conversation around these issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, one of the goals of having conversations like this is the conversation in and of itself. It's not to sway a belief or an understanding, but to have the conversation. And it seems to me that part of what is so attractive and thorny about this issue is the issue of identity. So when it comes to issues of race, everyone knows no one chose to be born the race that they were born. They're simply born into that race. If it was in another country, it might be born into that caste. And there's an understanding you have accepted where you are, and then you have to walk that journey, whether that journey means standing and actively fighting against oppression, or if that journey means assimilating or rising up, whatever that journey looks like. The issues of race are thorny, but they are clear for better and worse. The issue of sexual identity is totally different. And for me, it's also a theological issue. When you look at the temptation of Jesus, this is not a question of what are you going to do? This is who are you? If you are the Son of Man. This is the core question of our faith, comes down to identity. So I think it is thorny because you're asking people to wrestle with a God-given identity, a selected identity, an identity that they feel very protective over. And, I'm here at this AND campaign gathering with Justin Giboney, and I'm watching the banners all over. It's compassion and conviction. I think this is thorny because we've done a lot of conviction, and historically we haven't done the compassion part as well. So it's loaded. Maddie, I think you're right. It's loaded. There's so many angles you can take, but how do we have constructive conversations in a way that prayerfully lead us closer to, okay, this is how I can follow Christ in this way?
One of my takes on this has been that we're really bad at making distinctions in any of these conversations. The way I've thought about this in the past is that you kind of have, with transgenderism as a cultural phenomenon, you kind of have three versions of it. There's the adult who has said, I don't feel comfortable living as a man or as a woman, and I'm going to make this transition, and I'm going to live my life this way. And that's a phenomenon, like, it's very marginal, but it's been around for a really long time.
Yeah.
Then you have this second phenomenon, which is in many ways at the heart of this, which is, what do we do with young people? And I think, what are the implications of young people who transition at these young ages? And that's where you get into the entry into women's sports and all of this. You also get into the surgical and the chemical and all the rest that has very, very severe life implications. Yeah. And then you have this third phenomenon, and maybe we don't even touch this one because it's always so heated, but then you have this third phenomenon of kind of the other aspects of moral panic around it, with like drag queen story hour and sort of the more sort of flagrant expressions of it, the more confrontational expressions of it. And I think what I've noticed, and Maddie, I'm wondering how you think of this, what I've noticed is we don't seem to have a great ability to talk about those things as separate. Because in some ways, obviously, they're not entirely separate. But as a society, a pluralistic society, right, we have to deal with certain situations on their own terms. And so, one of the things you wrote, in fact, you even wrote this week, you've written about like the need for women's spaces to be protected spaces. That's a different conversation in many ways than those other two topics, particularly when it comes to some of these things related to women's sports.
Yeah, I think that before this issue really took off in the mainstream, I think most people probably were able to make those types of distinctions. I think there was a general prevailing libertarian ethic around this question, which is a lot of people didn't think this trying to change sex, I should say trying to change sex, because it isn't actually possible to change sex, but trying to change sex probably isn't really a good idea, but it is a free country. And certainly, it's nice to be nice. And if somebody's presenting a certain way and wants to be addressed a certain way, fine, sure, whatever. I think that was probably the default position of a lot of people. And what happened is, as it became this activism became really demanding, really aggressive, and actually, unlike the gay rights movement, was not libertarian in how it was being framed. It was demanding total acceptance, total embrace of the new orthodoxy. I think people thought, well, wait a minute here. Before, I was willing to be courteous. I was willing to be generous. And now that you're making these demands, I'm not willing to go along with this at all. You've seen this certainly, I think, in the pronouns issue. So 5 years ago, I noticed that a lot of even conservatives were actually quite willing to use the preferred pronouns or preferred names or whatever of not just transgender individuals that they meet in their day-to-day lives, because I think most people that's fine, but they were willing to use it even in the context of a political debate. They were willing to use it about controversial activists. And I've seen that change. I've seen people just abandon this language. And I personally think, we're talking about the need for compassion, and I'm there with you. But I also think that, and if we want to talk about this from the perspective of Christianity, compassion isn't compassion unless it's truthful. And I do think that there's a danger here, again, not in the context of interpersonal interactions, but in the context of a political debate. If you're not able to use the language that serves your argument, if you're having an argument about the definition of sex and you're using the pronouns that are about identity, not about sex, you're undermining your argument. And so I think that the response has been forceful, but I think that forcefulness is at this point justified. Certainly in the context of political debates, I think it's justified and necessary.
I mean, I'm tracking with you with what you're saying. And I think when you say in the context of a political debate, the forcefulness is justified, I think it is difficult, if we don't disentangle the issues, it will be difficult to justify forcefulness when we have not seen historically that same forcefulness in justifying the rights of women, period. I mean, the rights of women, period. There's not been a whole rallying cry of let's create space for women. Women have had to fight for that. But now all of a sudden, now that the issues of women are roped into transgender issues, you see a rise of people saying, no, women's rights matter. So how do you determine the necessity of a distinctive conversation of women's rights and transgender conversations? How do you do that? And then secondly, how do you justify forcefulness in a time in our society when forcefulness looks like machine guns and levels of justifying your political perspective in ways that honestly harm others? What does that look like?
Sure. So the first question about making sure that there's a sincerity in this actually being about what's good for women. I think, honestly, we can look to the UK. I think that the UK, in the way this issue is playing out, is actually really interesting because we don't have, and I'm from the UK, we don't have a culture war. We don't really have a right-wing party. Even the Conservative Party is basically socially liberal. And so what you're seeing there is a grassroots-led resistance from women. And I should clarify, and it's important you brought this up, but I should clarify, but by forceful, I mean plain spoken English. That is the extent.
You do not mean machine guns getting rid of Bud Light.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I mean saying man when instead of transgender woman. I mean saying he and him instead of she and her. It's funny because 10, 20 years ago, that would not have been the definition of forceful.
That's right. Now forceful means a can of tomato soup.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. That would have been the definition of clarity, but that is what, so what I mean is I'm not going to play the game of this is what it means to be kind. I mean, the same people who are saying, be kind, and what they mean is use our language, are oftentimes the same people who are, as you mentioned, Mike, showing up and chasing a female speaker into a classroom where she has to barricade herself in for 3 hours. Or as happened to English women's rights activist recently who was on a tour called Let Women Speak. It's literally the extent of her aim at this point is to let women speak. She was in New Zealand and a mob of thousands of a lot of the male activists showed up and actually put her in physical danger. She could have been crushed just for using plain spoken language. And so, yeah, there's a definite need to be truthful, but we need to be careful because there's a confusion right now in our culture, I feel, between words and violence. And so there are people who say that language is violence and violence is expression. And this conflation, and it happens on both sides, it's dangerous. Words can certainly be hurtful, don't get me wrong, but it's not the same thing as taking out a firearm. It's not the same thing as showing up with your pitchforks.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because the language element, it's such an interesting issue to navigate because on the one hand, and I agree with you on this, on the one hand, what you're saying is the language is super important. And like if you watch the video of Riley Gaines getting chased down the hallway by the protesters, the chant that they're literally in her face screaming at her is trans women are women, right? And it's a language game. And there's been interesting stuff even sort of written about how that creates these blurred lines ideologically where, for instance, there was an interesting article a couple of weeks back about Politico, the publication Politico's style guide, in which one of the elements of the style guide was getting rid of the words trans women and trans men. If this was a trans woman, you were supposed to use the word woman. If this was a trans man, you were supposed to use the word man. And to go back to what you said, I mean, I remember hearing conservative people a couple of years ago saying, I'll use whatever pronoun somebody wants to use because it's just a matter of being polite, right? To me, what you're seeing in the way some of this stuff is employed now is it is an ideological issue where in ceding that ground, for instance, if you're a journalist, with a publication whose style guide says you can't call them trans women, you have to call them women, that's an ideology decision as much as it's a social or politeness. So on the one hand, it's like the language really does matter. On the other hand, you have to distinguish the fact that the language matters, but it's not violence to disagree about the way the language is employed. Because what was scary I imagine anyway, what was scary for Ms. Gaines last week was not the idea trans women are women. She's there to debate that idea. What's scary is 24 people cornering her and screaming it in her face. That's not about language. That's about the physical threat. I wonder, Nicole, as you think about this, what would faithful Christian presence look like as you imagine it in engaging these issues, particularly knowing what we know about the reactivity? Maddie, I'm sure you can attest to this. And I know this just from my limited experience. If you tweet something about this issue, look out, because your mentions are destroyed for the next few days, often with some of the most vile stuff you've ever heard.
Yeah.
So what do you imagine when you think pastorally, right? What a faithful witness on compassionate representation of truth looks like?
I mean, honestly, I've been asking myself this question for years, but especially now in such polarized times. It is not uncommon to see Christians on both sides of any argument arguing for their role and their position. And then as a result of that, it's not uncommon to find Christians who say, well, the only place to be is in the middle. But you cannot sit in the middle on all issues, and you will have to choose sides. So I think the faithful witness, as it shows up in conversations like these, has to show up in the full context. So, my question about women's rights, I would say on this issue for me to show up faithfully is not just to get into a conversation about transgender issues, but to get into a conversation about the issues facing women and to talk about what does it mean that for years and centuries, the church has silenced the voices of women, so much so that when a woman goes to speak, she is is assaulted on both sides? How do we as the church show up in a space that allows for voices to be heard? In terms of addressing people how they want to be addressed, that feels very sticky for me. I mean, I can mentally in my mind argue both sides, mostly because I have friends and people that I know, and I have chosen, in order to demonstrate the witness of Christ to them as individuals, I've chosen to honor where they are, but also I have a relationship with them. I'm on a journey with them. And how you show up on a journey with someone may be different than how you show up in a moment with them. So I don't know what that looks like. I think the question is so important that it's a question we must wrestle with. But I also wonder, is the answer to that question different based on our location in society? I mean, is your answer going to be different as a pastor than it would be as a barista? Is your answer going to be different as someone who leads a company versus someone who has a colleague that is going through a process? What does that look like? So I know I didn't quite answer the question, but I do think the question itself is exactly where we need to be. Lord, what does faithful witness look like in this for me now? And where have we failed in Christian witness over the years that might require a level of reconciliation and healing before I go with my convictions? That's the sticky part.
Well, and I think one of the things that's evident in your work, Maddie, as well, something you alluded to a minute ago, is that the sands on this issue are changing so fast. Mm-hmm. So it's really even hard to kind of understand, like, where is the ground under our feet on these things? Well, Maddie, thanks so much for joining us for this. I did want to ask one last question, because I do think this is an interesting element of this. And this, maybe I could throw this to both of you, because you'll both be able to speak to this more than me. One of the things you said, Nicole, is, desiring to honor the role of women, the voice of women, the place of women. And part of what I've seen in the debate, something you've advocated, Maddie, as well, is that we need to understand the protection of women's spaces, as an issue of honoring the role of women. You had a piece a few weeks ago where you pointed out, like, that people were winning awards for, like, Woman of the Year, Woman Athlete of the Year, Woman Public Servant of the Year, kind of across the board. And they were all biological men who were occupying those spaces. When I have it framed that way, that seems to me to be one of the more critical places where we ought to look at this and go, man, something is really, truly pernicious about this, especially when we think about honoring the voices and the roles of women.
So I think it starts with a recognition of anatomical sex. And the reason that might seem like an obvious thing to say, but feminism, I think, when it really got going in the mid to late 20th century, it made the decision that women were oppressed because sex and the role of sex and sex stereotypes were sort of these social constructs. And they certainly had a point, like, don't get me wrong. But I think they sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater. And they threw out the need to acknowledge certain realities that make men and women different. They threw out fertility, pregnancy, even things like women are physically weaker than men. So there's an innate biological vulnerability as well as a social one, right? In the way that men are conditioned to think about women. There is also something biologically going on there. And I think what's actually really interesting about the resistance to transgenderism led from women's rights groups, and I'm thinking of the ones in the UK, but they certainly exist here as well, is that there's a return to, I wouldn't say biological essentialism, but I would say biological realism. There's a return to a need to acknowledge that women are different than men. And that difference is what makes sex-based rights so essential. That's what makes women having their own sports category, their own private facilities so essential. And I think actually it's interesting because with feminism's throwing out the baby with the bathwater, you ended up in a position where rather than sex determine everything, it determined nothing. And so sex was basically what? A costume, a performance. And what I think's been really encouraging is seeing these women rights groups recast the biology of sex and what it means to be a woman as something positive. You had a thing on Twitter recently where a lot of women were saying, hey, like, I've had 4 pregnancies and I've survived breast cancer. Like, here's all these ways that were like really challenging and really difficult. but I thrived and I'm proud to be a woman, and no man can ever say what I've just said. I kind of acknowledgement of the incredible mystery and sometimes challenge that comes with our biology. And I think it's a positive development.
As Maddie was talking, I was thinking about the article that I saw about Dylan Mulvaney bringing tampons around. I chuckled when I saw, the idea of carrying tampons, because there are some things that are uniquely women. And what you're saying, there has to be a space in the understanding of God's gift of distinction, that distinction can be very different, but not less than. I mean, this is at the core almost of every political and theological argument. What does distinction look like in a way that is still honorable, in a way that still has a place and value and meaning? So how do we do that in a way that doesn't, like you said, create a little mask that, hey, if you just carry a tampon, you're good? No. You have to know what menstrual, let me not go into the gross things, but like there's a unique experience that is distinct and not less than. And to your point, as a response to that, Black women came up with womanism. And the idea of womanism allows for this distinction, but also a need for community. I am a woman who needs a man in my life, but not because I can't, show up in a room by myself, but because I recognize my difference and yours. And I recognize the need for each other because of our differences.
Well, I think that's a great place to land. Madeline, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Nicole, thank you again. Good to see you as always.
Always.
And we will be right back. Joining me now is Daniel Solomon, news editor for Christianity Today. Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good to be here.
So you had an article this week I want to start with, and it was called Carl Henry's Temptation and Ours. And it's reflections on a new book that's come out called The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover. It's a great piece. We'll link it in the show notes. I encourage people to read it. But in order to get into that conversation, why don't we start? Can you tell us a little bit, for people who aren't familiar, who's J. Edgar Hoover? And beyond what they may have heard in the movie Clue, why does he matter to this conversation?
Mostly for what happens in Clue. No. J. Edgar Hoover was the longtime director of the FBI, really took the FBI, turned it into an American institution, a sort of massive law enforcement agency, and built it in his own image. Was a director almost half a century, I think 48 years. So all through multiple administrations, crafting America's law and order. There's been a period right now of historians kind of reassessing him as this massive figure and rethinking how influential he was sort of across American life. Everything from how the government treated the civil rights movement and spied on and tried to undermine the civil rights movement, to how the government didn't respond that way to like the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1960s. So Hoover is pretty controversial, pretty important for understanding the second half of the 20th century, and also bad. Like he's very clearly racist. He's very clearly paranoid. He's very clearly invested in these kind of repressive hierarchies and just the notion of order. And, for all the emphasis on law and order, doesn't seem to care about the law part when it applies to him. So the record of extra legal investigations, buggings, break-ins, black bag jobs, attempts to get Martin Luther King to kill himself as a government activity are very well documented. And even at the time was pretty well known. Like if you were in power, if you were in the circles that, interacted, you knew a lot of this stuff. It was pretty well known, for example, that almost every president would try and get rid of him, and he would dig up dirt on the president and be like, well, you wouldn't want this to get out now, would you? So they have that with Kennedy, you have that with Johnson, you have that with Nixon, and he dies while Nixon is in office. This is important to Christianity today and the history of Christianity today and the history of evangelicalism, because he also published a whole series of articles, I think 11 total. I could be wrong on that, but a number of articles, more than just one, in CT. And he wasn't an evangelical. He wasn't born again. He didn't talk about his personal relationship with Jesus. He very much preaches, I think I call it in the piece, patriotic deism. America is great, and part of our greatness is church and the Bible and the respectability of middle-class people sending their kids to Sunday school. And that's kind of what he writes for CT. And one of the founding editors really loves these articles, almost fawns over Hoover, even knowing some of these questionable things about Hoover and Hoover's desire for power. And this book by Martin gets into this question of like, well, what does this say about CT? What does this say about evangelicalism? What are we to make from the vantage point of 2023? What are we to make of this history where a magazine that is trying to define evangelicalism, that is trying to sort of plant the flag, is eagerly publishing the head of the FBI, who has nothing to do with evangelicalism, but everything to do with these kind of defense of a social order?
Yeah, it's a fascinating article, and it sent me down a rabbit trail reading many of these pieces by Hoover that were published. They're still all available on CT's site. You used at one point, you used the word pablum to describe them. And I think it's a perfect word because you read these articles, and along with this sort of patriotic law and order stuff that he repeats in almost every single piece, there's these cliche-filled, generalized images of like American life, American family life, the role of the pastor as, one point he talks about, criminals with tears in their eyes telling special agents that, they wish they'd followed the advice given to them by their pastors when they were young. And he talks about the breakdown of the American family and the fact that people don't say the blessing at the meal anymore. And he says at one point, to miss this fellowship is to deprive boys and girls of their rightful heritage. So you really do have this deep thread of Christian nationalism that isn't, like you say, like it isn't evangelical. It's broad and it's generic. And the reason I mentioned here is it's kind of shocking given what, in particular, I believe it would have been Carl Henry, who was the editor-in-chief at the time of these things, what Henry's standards for what contributors were bringing to Christianity today in terms of the quality of the writing as well as the quality of the thought and the clarity of the thought. These things stick out like sore thumbs.
They're terrible. They're terrible articles. They're terrible. They're terrible because of their vision of what Christianity is. I mean, it's this real perversion of like, it's just Christianity as social control. Christianity as like a crime prevention measure. Like that's such a perversion, but they're also terrible for their vision of America, personally, I think. And in their writing, they're just these banal, just, yeah. And they're ghost written. We know that Hoover didn't write them himself. They're, and he almost plagiarizes himself from article to article. It's almost like just repeating the same stock of cliches about how vital preachers are to the fate of America. And I think that gives us an insight actually into what was going on. There is a political issue there. Carl Henry and Billy Graham and Nelson Bell and the other like founders of CT were interested in a kind of political project, both like that Christianity should be relevant in the public square, should be speaking to the issues of the day, and also to this like, we're going to call America back to God. And I think there are definitely moments when they confuse the work of the church and the work of the state. I think, and any honest reckoning has to say, oh no, that happened. That happened multiple times. But as you look at these articles and you look at Henry saying things like, oh, you're just, we such a pleasure to always publish you, Mr. FBI director. It doesn't seem like it's the political vision that really pulled him in. It seems like it was the flattery. Like Hoover, who's this super important person, who's very powerful, is saying, oh, ministers are so important. You guys do crucial work. You do vital work. And it really seems like that bit of flattery, that chance at respectability, that invitation to be important, was the reason that Henry lost his editorial sense and also his sense of what evangelicalism needed to be about.
I had two thoughts as I was reading some of these as well that I think are in line with this. One is the power of the political vision of someone like Hoover and most of the presidents he collaborated with in the midst of the Cold War, like the power of that, the rhetoric, the political vision, fear of communism, this immense fear of this, and rightly so, of a godless, totalitarian kind of movement that was on the move, was such that it seems to me, as I read it, I thought about Hoover coming along and writing these things. And it actually reminded me, Hannah Arendt, she talks about how one of the ways you can tell that people have stopped thinking is that their language becomes full of stock phrases and cliches and these sort of repeated things. And it's almost as though the editors at CT sort of turn the page when Hoover shows up and they're thinking through that political vision rather than the theological vision. And all of this stuff resonates from a different place because you're worried about the social hierarchies, not so much because of this vision of the kingdom of God that I think you can actually hear beautifully articulated at times in Billy Graham's preaching, but rather because it comes from Hoover, you read it through the social and political lens in a way that makes it a lot easier to go, well, I know I'm on board with that because I'm afraid of the commies, right?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to forget that most of the 20th century history, whatever people are talking about, they're also talking about the Cold War. That's right behind all of these issues. And maybe as a lesson for us, I think we have to be careful when we are thinking of our opponents, we're thinking of our enemies, when we're thinking of the other guys in these ways, whether it's true that they're as evil as this, that they're, totalitarians running gulags or not. There's something about that opposition that convinces people, and Christians are not free of this, that convinces people that the very worst things are authorized, that it's okay to do terrible stuff because we're fighting those people and they're so much worse. Right. So I'm writing a religious biography of Richard Nixon right now, and this happens in Nixon's life over and over again. Before he does the worst things that he does, he spends a bunch of time talking about what the Democrats have done, and it's even the little kid thing, well, he did it first, right? That's part of what's happening. And you do see this in the publication of those articles by Edgar Hoover. It's a terrible article. It's not well written, but it's justified because of the kind of emergency situation, because we're fighting this horrific cause.
Right. I mean, you can look at some of the worst examples of the 20th century and the way that works out. Himmler would tell the Germans that courage for the sake of service to the state was the willingness to go against your conscience and do terrible things, that was the vision of bravery and courage. And obviously, that's an extreme example, but you think about the way an ideology takes over of, the fear of the, like you said, fear of the other, whether that's Democrats or communists or whatever, however you're defining your opposition. Something about ideology has a way of creating those equations in your head that say, well, the ends will justify the means. Even if I'm going against my own conscience, it's worth it to do these things.
I wanted with the piece to think about how that move that you just described there is also present in my own thinking. Yeah. Is also present right now, that this isn't just a challenge to CT editors back in the day, but in our current moment. And I find, in my own heart, as someone who doesn't like Christian nationalism and never got close to supporting Donald Trump, that there is a way I can make that move where I think the temptations that confront me and the temptations that confront my version of American evangelicalism are just totally different than those people over there, right? That they succumbed to temptations to access to power, but I would never. And there's this historiographical version of the story we tell too, where there's like the good old evangelicalism with Billy Graham and Carl Henry, and then things got bad. And I think, a really valuable part of this book is saying, hey, this challenge, this temptation, this ability to embrace a completely amoral pragmatism for the sake of a little flattery, a little access to power, a little privilege. This is a challenge to all of us. This is something that I need to be on guard against, not just those other people, not just those ideologues, but the good ones. The good ones are also sinful.
One of the things you got at in the article that I want to make sure we talk about is the extent to which this kind of compromise, is it a feature of human nature or is it a feature of something that's unique to evangelicalism? I think from the way you've described it, it sounds like the book definitely wants to sort of link some of these compromises to the compromises we see today and kind of highlight it as a feature of evangelical Christianity. Is that correct? And if so, do you think that's a fair characterization?
That is definitely part of what's happening in the book. There's like specific arguments that this kind of politics is intrinsic maybe or essential to evangelicalism, that it's all the way down. And I don't think that's right. I think the evidence, even in the book, which is really incredibly well researched, the evidence is that a lot of people succumbed to this. A lot of people ended up supporting Hoover's political vision, whether or not they actually cared about or even knew the political vision, but just because of the access to power. So there are people who aren't Christian who end up supporting white Christian nationalism. There are people who aren't white who end up supporting white Christian nationalism. Like, it's a complicated, people get lured in a lot of different ways, I guess. Mm-hmm. That said, that's not a reason as an evangelical to let evangelicalism off the hook, right? The challenge again of going like, those other people, like, we have to be fiercely honest. We have to be self-critical. We have to shine light on ourselves. I think there's this, this larger conversation. Can evangelicalism be reformed from what it is today? And one of the answers is it doesn't need to be reformed. I don't think that's right. One of the answers is no, it can't. It should all go in the scrap heap of history. I don't agree with that. I think most CT readers would also say, no, it can be reformed. But what do we got to do that? Well, we have to listen to voices we haven't listened to before. We have to look in some of the corners we've kind of kept dark and do a kind of rigorous truth-telling through journalism, through history, through just refusing to shirk off these kinds of historical moments when they come to our attention again.
I was struck, even just as you were talking about it, there's this funny way, I think, particularly Christianity in the West gets sort of sandwiched with this and skewered with this idea that it's constantly catering to, the politics of power and all of this. And I remember years ago, somebody pointed out there's this kind of infamous writings of D.T. Suzuki, the sort of great Zen master of the 20th century, where during the time of Japanese imperialism, when they're invading, declaring war on China and have these sort of imperialist visions for all of the East, Suzuki writes about it and writes to the soldiers and basically says, these ambitions are not a contradiction with our Zen beliefs about the unity of all things. You just need to recognize that when you stick your bayonet into the body of your enemy soldier, that this is just one other aspect of the oneness of all things. The bayonet is one with him. You are one with him as you conquer your enemies and all this stuff. And it's like this horrific vision of and horrific justification of, a war of aggression coming from Zen Buddhism, which in the States we often sort of romanticize as being immune to that sort of thing. And I think it's important when we talk about the politics of power and faith, that's human nature, to want to take the way we think about ultimate things and use it as a justification or use it as a bridge somehow to power politics and power ambitions generally.
There's also this really persistent idea that if I just think the right things, if I'm on the right side, if I embrace the right beliefs, that I will be protected, that I won't face those temptations that are common to all men. one of the things that I find continually convicting and compelling and just persuasive about the sort of Christian theology and evangelical theology in particular is these ideas of sin that say it's not other people. It's not those guys. And you can't get out of it by just being one of the good ones or just thinking the right things or doing good works, right? That's not how we can really escape the problem. I go back to this Reinhold Niebuhr quote, which I really love, where he said, the problem with the children of light is that they're naive. They're not naive about the children of darkness. They're naive about the power of self-interest for themselves, right? We know if you're one of the good ones, like, you know that the bad people are bad. You got that. But it's you too, buddy. It's you too.
Right. Well, Daniel, thanks for this conversation, and we will be right back. We are back. Daniel Silliman is still with me, and he is here now for a regular segment here on the Bulletin called Hey Daniel, What's Weird? Daniel and I share interest in the odd and obscure in American religion. So, Daniel, what's weird?
Today, I have some weirdness for you that involves a mail mix-up, a postal service snafu, if you will. It really gets at the weirdness of American religious history and also the wideness of American religious history. I love these moments as you're reading, as you're researching, you find these moments where people come together, where movements suddenly merge, right? Worlds collide. You've got two very different people, one's over here, one's over here. And then suddenly they're in the same room and you're like, what is happening? How are these people? We try to keep it all straight and all in boxes, but they end up in the same place. Sometimes you get them like moments where, like, Benjamin Franklin shows up at a George Whitefield revival, and you're just like, okay, they're in the same space. Sometimes you get a person in common. That can be a weirdness where worlds come together. My favorite there is, you may know this, Stephen King and Jerry Jenkins shared an audiobook narrator. So if you were driving around in the 90s, scared of being left behind, and then later driving around in the 90s being scared of a like killer clown mystical thing, same voice in your head.
I've got one. Let me throw one in here for you. I'm not talking out of turn because both of them tell this story in memoirs of their own. Stormy O. Martin's Power of a Praying Wife, as an author, describes the first like deep love of her life was a magician that she worked with at Knott's Berry Farm, who turned out to be Steve Martin, the comedian.
Wow.
They both describe this love in their memoirs. So, all right, go ahead.
So another whole category of these is correspondences, people who exchange letters that you wouldn't expect. My favorite one there is not religious particularly, but it's P.T. Barnum and Mark Twain. They wrote a bunch of letters back and forth complaining about being famous and how like terrible it was to be famous in the 19th century.
Oh, that's
and like
great.
People trying to pitch them on stuff. People would apparently try and sell P.T. Barnum every weird thing they found in America. So this story is a little bit like that. It involves letters. It involves the two, maybe the farthest apart religious men at one moment happening to be in the same place, in the same time, and confused for each other frequently. This is Ukiah, California, mid-1950s, early 1960s. And Ukiah, for those who don't know, is a little town, Northern California, kind of a logging town, not a lot going on, just a few streets surrounded by redwoods. I think there's like one main street, but there's a west road, Ukiah, and an east road. And on the west road in the 1950s, 1960s, you have the home of the Reverend James Warren. And on the east road, you have the home of the Reverend James Warren Jones. Very confusing. Different, but close. West Road, this is the father of the future megachurch and purpose-driven life author Rick Warren. East Road, James Warren Jones, apparently used his middle name, maybe just to be confusing. I don't know. But this is the man who will go on to declare himself Messiah, take his commune to Guyana.
Holy crap.
Convince his followers to drink poison Kool-Aid and murder a congressman. So James Jones of Jonestown fame, Rick Warren's dad, very confused for each other. The mailman could not keep them straight.
Wow.
They did not have a lot of contact. They didn't meet up at ministerial association meetings in Ukiah, but they did have to get their mail fixed all the time. If that's not an example of how weird American religion is and how diverse it is, and yet confused for each other with some poor postman.
Wow. All right. That is definitely weird. All right. Well, thank you, Daniel, for joining us today on the Bulletin, and thank you for listening, and we will see you next week. All right. Thanks each of you for listening. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick. It's produced by Matt Stevens, hosted by Mike Cosper and Russell Moore. Our music is by Dan Phelps. Our graphic design is by Brian Todd. Additional design by Dady Creative. Social media by Kate Lucky. Associate producer, Azure Phelps. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.